been very open about my views, on gay marriage, on abortion, on transgenderism. Sohrab Ahmari certainly is as well. And our collaborators are happy to work with us despite those views, and I think that sets them apart from a lot of people who are on the left, broadly understood, who are totally unwilling to be around people who have such horrible, backward, regressive views.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo and Nate.
Today, Matthew Schmitz, one of the founders and editors of the new magazine Compact, is joining us to talk about the vision for the magazine, which is a stated editorial mission statement pushing against the libertine left and the libertarian right. In its short life, the magazine has already been the subject of numerous reports by right-of-center and mainstream outlets alike. Thanks for joining us today, Matthew, to tell us more about what to expect from Compact.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started with our interview, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you would like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. And I'd also like to invite ISI alumni, faculty, and supporters to attend our second inaugural homecoming weekend featuring Victor Davis Hanson, Ross Douthat, Patrick Deneen, among others, which will take place at ISI's beautiful campus in Wilmington, Delaware on May 13th through the 14th. So if you're interested, please go to our website to register. So Matthew, thanks for joining. And obviously the subject of this discussion is going to be this new magazine that you founded. So I guess to start us off, could you tell us more about what Compact is? And for listeners who may not yet be familiar, could you tell us about what motivated you and your co-founders? And could you tell us who your co-founders are too, which is on your website, of course, but for our listeners' purposes, what motivated you all to launch the magazine when you did?
Compact is a membership-supported web publication that I founded with Sohrab Ahmari and Edwin Aponte. Now, Sohrab was an editor at the Wall Street Journal opinion page, at Commentary Magazine, and most recently at the New York Post. He was, for many years, I would say, the golden boy of the neoconservative movement or the interventionist tendency on the right. My other co-founder, Edwin Aponte, was previously the editor of The Bellows, which is sometimes described as a post-leftist publication, but describes itself as a labor-populist organ. Basically, The Bellows was created by Edwin in response to the fact that a lot of people had become disillusioned with the Bernie left, DSA, millennial socialism, the kind of thing represented by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And that disillusionment had a couple of sources. One was simply the failure of Bernie's campaign, but that political failure seemed to be part of a broader failure. A lot of people began to suggest that the left was more, the Bernie left even, was more interested in, certain weird cultural obsessions than it was with, actually promoting policies that help working men. I think that, the DSA did and does have a certain class of politics, but really its politics are about helping the particular class that its members tend to belong to, which is the kind of more precarious segment of the professional managerial class, the people who have these kind of email jobs that maybe don't occupy the higher rungs in their organizations. So that's where Edwin comes out of. And, he had that disillusionment with the Bernie left. Sohrab, I think, had a great deal of disillusionment with the interventionist tendency in foreign policy, which he had been such an active and eloquent spokesman for, especially when it came to the with the kind of youth uprisings in the Arab world. He edited a book about this democratic tendency in the Arab world. But the so-called Arab Spring, resulted in an Islamist winter, you could say, as what were perceived to be secular democratic youth movements actually resulted in the empowerment of Islamist parties like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which was even worse for the Christians there than what had gone before, which wasn't that pretty either. So that's where they come out of. For the last 11 years, I've been an editor at First Things magazine, working for Russ Severino. It's brilliant and a courageous editor. And I had become convinced that I wanted to join with people who weren't just social conservatives, but had shared a sense that there was something deeply wrong in our politics, and that we needed kind of more material class-based analysis of that to understand what the actual array of forces was. And so from this unlikely pairing of these three different people, compact emerged.
So Matthew, it's interesting to hear you talk about a material class-based politics, but also obviously you're critical of DSA, for example. I think it's pretty clear from reading Compact and from being familiar with you and Saurabh's work where you guys distinguish yourselves from the sort of traditional fusionist orthodoxy on the right. And I think that'll probably be familiar to a lot of our listeners. But I'm curious to hear you dig into a little bit more about why you and the other contributors to the magazine think that the DSA's brand of politics, at least in its contemporary form, is not really an authentic or a full class politics, where they go wrong and where you think something like Compact can correct those defects.
I think it is a class politics, but it is a concealed class politics based on certain delusions. DSA people imagine that they're speaking up for American workers. They're really just speaking up for themselves, and their proposals will help members of their class, but really no one else. I can never have any real truck with the DSA people because I think that family, community, country are not necessarily evil things. That's the real dividing line for me. And I think probably I think that's probably true for a lot of people the DSA would like to speak for. They're never going to go in for their kind of weird, politics of, abolish the family, automate reproduction with mass machine surrogacy to liberate women. I mean, the stuff you find in a kind of verso DSA universe is it's sort of like a loopy, sci-fi socialism that really seeks to abolish everything that's natural.
Some people might think that, it's kind of like strange bedfellows, perhaps if they're not acquainted with what's happening in kind of, I guess I'll call it post-liberal sphere for just the purposes of what I'm about to say, but they might think that it's strange bedfellows for the labor-populist left to kind of join with the populist right. And so how do you think Compact will be able to do that without yielding some of the non-negotiables of social conservatism? Is that possible? Is that something that, editorially you're willing to concede for the sake of, this this larger kind of coalition building? Where do you see there being overlap, and where do you see there being enough of disagreements that you think that would be represented in the publication?
Yeah, well, America is a very big country. Not everyone in it happens to share my views, excellent as I think they are. So obviously getting along will always be a matter of negotiation and reaching some kind of modus vivendi. Compact, I think, is notable because it has social conservatives leading the organization, but it's not an exclusively socially conservative project. I mean, Compact is not a conservative magazine. It doesn't seek to, kind of defend true conservatism. I think that, the Bulwark, when it launched, said that it's sought to conserve conservatism, and it was invested in this project of saying we're the real conservatives, other people aren't. Compact doesn't purport to do that. So I don't think one should expect it to be conservative as such. It'll have, a whole variety of elements. But I'm very open about my views on gay marriage, on abortion, on transgenderism. Saurabh Mari certainly is as well. And our collaborators are happy to work with us despite those views. And I think that sets them apart from a lot of people who are on the left, broadly understood, who are totally unwilling to be around people who have such horrible, backward, regressive views.
It seems like you're saying, the socialist left as it's currently constituted isn't offering a full or authentic working class politics, largely because of its cultural views, right? And you listed a number, as well as perhaps, it stands on something like immigration, the DSA's antipathy to even the concept of a nation state, right? We're all familiar with those issues with the DSA. In terms of their economic program and their economic worldview, though, I mean, I think what you were saying about the DSA sort of representing the interests of the class of people who are the activists in the DSA is certainly visible in something like their interest in student loan debt forgiveness, which is a handout often to very wealthy people. But what in general do you think, is there substantive divergences between maybe someone like you and Sohrab and the DSA on economic matters? And where are those divergences if they do exist? Or do you think they have it more or less right on economics and the real substantive differences between you and them is largely on the cultural questions?
If you talk to people on the left, they say things, we just care about, material issues. We're not interested in this culture war stuff. We really go in for this tough, hard-headed, class-based analysis. And it's all just a crock. They will only exclude you for deviation on the so-called cultural issues. Now, very often our cultural contests are also class contests of various forms. They are about contention between different groups with slightly different economic interests. It's very common. I think you mentioned student loan debt forgiveness. That's an excellent example. It's not just a policy that doesn't benefit the poorest Americans. It's not just a handout to the members of the DSA. Also, as generally proposed, it would be a huge handout to the universities, which are not one of the healthiest elements in our society. And the notion that the U.S. government should be pumping even more money into these institutions is crazy, and it's not. It's basically the DSA supports socialism for members of its class, but not really for others.
So it seems like, Matt, everything that you're saying there, I think, would be perfectly comfortable in sort of mainstream legacy conservative institutions in terms of the critiques of both the DSA's cultural politics, but also of aspects of their economic program. But obviously, you started Compact in the interests of challenging consensuses on the right and the left. So where do you think, and you're collaborating with leftists, albeit often, I think, heterodox leftists. So where is the crossover with a certain strain of sort of left-wing thinking, maybe particularly on economics, that would make Compact distinct from the standard right-wing publications that are available right now?
Well, just if you look at what we've published so far, we had a piece by my co-founder and friend Sohrab Ahmari about labor unions, and he was hailing the organization efforts at the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, and he drew on the scholarship of a man named Michel, who had been an official in the Obama administration and is a progressive scholar of labor. And Sohrab uses Michel's analysis to understand our current labor struggles. Now, this analysis is not one that would be relied upon by any conservative think tank scholar or by any right-wing journalist. And that's something that, you would certainly not be able to get on the page at National Review.
Editorially speaking, what would you say are some of the subjects or beats or, maybe human interest pieces and commentary or news reports, it can be anything, that have been neglected by mainstream outlets and maybe more, institutionally entrenched right-leaning outlets that they've completely neglected, or maybe they've kind of shunned it altogether? Obviously, the post-liberals have kind of, there's a post-liberal Substack. There's kind of this kind of building off of a populist momentum. I think that has attracted a lot of, especially in ISI's orbit, a lot of young students. I actually had one of my colleagues tell me that he went to a debate at Harvard between Patrick Deneen and Michael Anton the other day. And when he was talking to the students, they were all telling him that, all conservative Harvard students are leaning towards post-liberalism. You can't really find a free market fundamentalist among them. So it's interesting to hear that from a school that has housed, for example, the College Republicans, which has kind of, historically speaking, been big tent. So I'm interested in hearing kind of more about, from an editorial perspective, you have someone like Walter Kern, obviously a very famous author. You have Jeff Schellenberger, who I've been following for a while. And you have contributing editors like Adrian Rimul and Slavoj Žižek, both quite well-known names. So obviously they're not all in unison with each other per se, but it seems like they all have these criticisms of liberalism generally. And in your mission statement, you say you're perhaps not agitating against liberality, but liberalism itself. So Can you talk about how you're going to kind of manifest that in your editorial vision, and what kind of pieces will you want written about? What kind are you looking for? And what, generally speaking, are your expectations for, I guess, the outlook for the editorial mission of Compact?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a couple parts to it. You mentioned there are already, of course, many magazines that exist on both the left and the right. On the left you have something like a Jacobin. On the right you have National Review. All of these magazines do good work. They all have their distinct missions. I think of something like National Review as really being a magazine that seeks to define what conservatism is, to kind of help determine who's in, who's out of it, and to be a bit of a big tent. You have something like Commentary, which is loyal to the neoconservative project in both domestic politics and with the neoconservative reassessment of social programs, policing, and also to the neoconservative stance in favor of interventionism in foreign affairs. Something like Jacobin really seeks to be a vehicle for this movement, the Bernie left, which has really petered out. Compact, what we've seen in just the first few weeks of its existence, is that the contributors, as disparate as they are, probably their greatest kind of current area of agreement is against the crest of enthusiasm that we've seen in response to Russia's wrongful invasion of Ukraine, where people are pushing for increasingly aggressive responses from the NATO alliance and from the USA.
I'm curious to tease out or hear more about what you foresee as potential tensions between the both within the magazine and sort of in the broader coalition that I think Compact is trying to exemplify, between folks who come from a sort of traditionally more conservative background and a more traditional leftist background. Because I'm someone who is sympathetic to a lot of the aspects of new sort of strains of thinking about economics on the right that emphasize community, family, solidarity, the integrity of the nation state over, I think, the sort of neoliberal consensus that has governed certainly right-wing politics in recent years. But I also take seriously the sort of traditional conservative critique or concern that the expansion of government bureaucracy in particular often serves to crowd out and ultimately harm a lot of the local ties and sort of the local community obligations and sense of sort of patriotic obligation that conservatives are trying to preserve. And I think that's what would distinguish a sort of conservative pro-family, pro-community economics from a leftist one, which is much more bullish on just the expansion of the federal government. Do you think that's something that, is that a conversation that folks at Compact are having? Do you think that's a conversation that's going to happen in your pages? And what do you make of that tension?
Yeah, I think there's certainly going to be a tension on that and countless other issues. It probably won't be an issue that ever comes to the fore of public debate and leads to really, strong disagreements, just because, kind of growth of government is not probably a first order concern for anyone outside of the world of little magazines and think tanks. I mean, yes, obviously it does crowd out family and local institutions. The same is true of capitalism. So I think another thing that the right in particular has to think about, and it has been thinking about, is just how corporations have changed and continue to change. It's not just government that is a threat to liberty. It's also corporations, which it's not just that they are causing problems because they're relentlessly seeking the profit motive, and you have the Gordon Gekko types. I mean, there's this increasing sort of HRization of public life, especially enforced through corporations. And I think that the right-wing response has basically been to say, corporations ought to stay out of politics. Corporations should be a place where you come and you work and you don't bring your politics into it. You've seen quite a bit of that in some corporations. I think Coinbase maybe is one of them. A few tech corporations have taken this stance. And I wonder if that isn't a little untrue to human nature and to economic history. if you look at, someone like Max Weber, he pointed out that, in Roman society, professions would be organized into corporations where, if you were a member of a profession, you would feast together, you would have a shared burial ground. And so there was a political life tied to professional life. And he believed there was something natural about this, and that the medieval guild system, which you sometimes hear conservatives of a certain type talk about, that wasn't a sort of singular creation. It was actually a revival of a classical form. And he expected that we would see something like this, come about in the wake of the economic changes wrought by industrialization and economic liberalism. And I think that he was right about that. And I think that our so-called woke corporations are examples of corporatism, because they are corporatism is it's basically a coordination of government, labor, and capital, usually with some ideological aim. And I think that through American civil rights law and the kind of HR apparatus, we're really at that point of coordinating government, labor, and capital on specific ideological lines. So this is what one scholar, Howard Wearda, he predicted that we would see creeping corporatism become increasingly prominent in the West. I think that's exactly what's happened, and I find it quite unwelcome development. But I would say that on this one issue, just I'm using it as an example. On this one issue, I think that I would distinguish myself from most conservatives, because I think that conservatives would generally say, well, corporations just ought not to be involved in politics. They ought not to be dictating what flag you should wave, or pronouns, or these things. But I'm not sure that's altogether realistic. I mean, I certainly don't like the ideology on offer. I think generally, just as it's unnatural to expect that men shouldn't bring their religion and their beliefs into politics, it's very unnatural to imagine that they wouldn't bring it into the workplace, which is such an important part of life.
Right. And I think, when you hear a lot of conservatives still today talk about things like corporate power in these sort of neutral, apolitical terms, it does betray a sort of emaciated libertarian view of this distinction between the public and the private square that I do think sort of fails to account for the nature of political life. But with that being said, Matt, I mean, one thing that you were talking about is corporatism. And I think something that you've heard from, or a critique that you might hear from the sort of more limited government, sort of small government kinds of conservatives, is that a lot of corporate wokeness, and specifically the HRocracy, the bureaucratization of corporate America today, is the direct result, downstream in this case, of the bureaucratization of government. I mean, this is something that von Mises was writing about back in the 1920s, where the nature of bureaucratic capitalism, and then with the Civil Rights Act, what became sort of woke bureaucratic capitalism, is the result of large, overweening government bureaucracies. And that, to me, it raises challenging questions about how to use state power to take on woke capital when it's, at least if you subscribe to this view, a lot of the aspects of woke capital that conservatives rightly object to are the result of state power in the first place. I don't know. What would you make of that criticism?
Well, I'm sure that I haven't read von Mises. I'm sure he makes a number of good points. I mean, one issue we have is that there are so many people who are part of our workforce and who have financial obligations, have received educations, are ready to take up a place in our society. And if we didn't have something like, HR, it's not clear what they would do. So it might, something like HR, it might be trying to address some of the issues created by the expansion of the labor force with the entrance of women into the workforce, into the formal workforce to an unprecedented degree. And I would just say that, you can look at something like, a previous model of corporatism, in Salazar's Portugal, there's very little reason to think that it did any economic good for the country. It wasn't increasing efficiency or output, but what it probably did was stabilize Salazar's regime by taking the 2,000 or so university graduates in Portugal every year and integrating them into the regime by giving them positions, making sure that the people making rope were doing so in a Catholic manner or whatever, which is faintly absurd, but it probably kept those people from becoming revolutionary cadres. And I think that there's a bit of that going on with our current creeping corporatism.
I have a question about, and I'm curious on your thoughts on this. This is just an observation I've made. And obviously there is kind of this involvement between the labor-populism and populist right that kind of you're trying to strike in this magazine. Something that I've also observed is mostly by fusionists or by people who aren't quite as concerned with this potential threat, but the kind of dissident liberals who ultimately are going to police the right on social issues, on cultural matters, whether it's, things related to sexuality, they'll ultimately maybe side with conservatives on matters like, a campus academic freedom and other campus related issues. But when it comes to matters that are of serious concern for, religious conservatives, they will police the right on those subjects and, call us the usual kind of repertoire of names like theocrats and bigots, et cetera, for, holding views that were not uncommon in 2008. But what do you think ultimately that kind of relationship between, at least in Compact, how do you think Compact is kind of perhaps won't fall into that same, I don't want to call it a trap because I think a lot of conservatives willingly fall into it. But how do you think Compact will differentiate itself from, or perhaps not allow itself to veer onto that course of permitting people who perhaps share a number of the same beliefs on important topics for sure, but when it comes down to matters that will impact, our children in a quite consequential way, they kind of want to put a cudgel on conservatives.
Yeah, there's anti-police sentiment on the left, and I think there's quite a bit of anti-thought police sentiment on the right. And when we formulated our kind of initial statement of principles for Compact, that's posted on our site, we didn't feel any temptation to define this project as one of heterodoxy or just a kind of a diversity of viewpoints. We wanted instead to speak in terms of certain commonalities. However limited or inevitably contested those would be, because I think one thing you see among members of the so-called intellectual dark web is this conceit, and I think it's really a false one, that you can beat a false ideology or false movement with invocations of openness or disagreement or debate or procedure. All those things will end up being important in their place, but ultimately it takes something to beat something. You're going to have to rally around something if you want to counter something you think is bad. And I think that's just really a big limitation of the intellectual dark web as it's constituted up to this point. It's not at all accidental that it is populated by former new atheists who spent years railing against basically Sarah Palin's and George W. Bush's as incipient theocrats, which is a really incredible form of hysteria. And these people who deplore any form of what they call tribalism end up backing themselves into a corner where any form of solidarity or community is really almost fascist in kernel form, and they share that with the kind of more woke left, which they so furiously oppose. But they really aren't able to, maybe they simply aren't forthright about what their deeper commitments are. That's possible, and maybe that's prudent if they aren't. But they don't manage to distinguish themselves from the people they often oppose so eloquently.
So it's interesting because the critiques that I'm hearing you make about free speech absolutism, the sort of skepticism of this idea of the marketplace of ideas where, rationality characterizes debate, truth always wins out. That used to be the mainstream position, at least the outset of the conservative movement. This is something I've written a little bit about before with regards to, figures like William F. Buckley, whose first book was subtitled The Superstitions of Academic Freedom, and Wilmore Kendall and Russell Kirk. And, all of these folks were highly skeptical of the sort of John Stuart Mill classical liberal view of how free speech and debate works. But Compact is not positioning itself, I think, as an explicitly conservative magazine. It's positioning itself as a departure from movement conservatism, both, I think, historically constituted and, in its current state today. Why, if that's the sort of view that you guys are taking, which I think personally is the correct one, would you not be attempting to sort of reclaim what I think were the sort of traditional roots of movement conservatism, and why are you attempting to depart from it altogether?
Yeah, I didn't really think of Compact. I didn't think much of movement conservatism as such when, its history. When I was myself thinking about Compact, I guess I was thinking more about our present challenges. You make a great point about conservative debate on this right now. And the long rich history of conservative critiques of free speech absolutism. Yeah, but things have shifted pretty powerfully. If you look at institutions like AEI or efforts to engage the university campus, free speech is really the banner under which conservatives march right now. And I think in many ways that makes a lot of sense. And obviously there is a very necessary kind of liberty of speech and debate that's essential to intellectual life and to any kind of good life more broadly. But, as you say, conservatives do have a richer tradition. It would be good for them to reclaim one that recalls the purposes of the university, which, as you say, even Buckley did in his first and famous book.
One other question for you just about the masthead is the Compact bills itself as a journal of radical ideas. Curious what specifically you think makes Compact radical and what that radicalism constitutes.
Yeah, it's a striking term, isn't it? On our about page, we say that we're radical in a specific sense. Generally, that term is understood as meaning someone who's willing to go to extremes. But the kind of etymologically correct sense of the word is being willing to go to the root of things, to the heart of the matter, so to speak. And we define this somewhat eccentrically as being willing to talk about class as well as culture and material realities as well as ideologies. And so, what we are promising our readers is that we're going to be radical in the sense of trying to get to the root of things. And we understand that as being willing to talk about class divides as well as cultural differences and material interests as well as ideological commitments.
So we are starting to run out of time, Matthew, but a question that I definitely want to ask is obviously, you've kind of distinguished Compact from the conservative movement broadly. But obviously, just from your own background, first things, there are elements of conservatism in there. And I'm interested in kind of hearing, we ask all of our listeners this question, or all of our guests this question, what you would define conservatism as.
Conservatism is a movement defined around political activism and intellectual entrepreneurship that seeks to trim back the excesses of liberalism and to articulate a warm patriotism toward the American nation and a love of its people.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew. If people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you, where can they find you?
Compactmag.com. Encourage you to read and subscribe.
Great. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Marlo.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.